Hello everybody, and welcome back to Brewmasters, where we're talking to accomplished homebrewers for D&D 5th edition. Today we're speaking to the Angry GM, author of The Angry GM RPG Advice with Attitude, and creator of theangrygm.com, filled with articles that will help you hack Dungeons & Dragons, from reverse engineering monsters to advice on improving battles, improv, writing a campaign, making adventures, just about everything you can think of. Before we get to that though, here's your regular reminder to like and subscribe, and if you're enjoying the channel, don't forget to make a ranged attack against that bell icon. Remember that you're always welcome to suggest topics or guests you'd love to see on the channel. Hey guys, so just a quick announcement before we begin. So if you've been following the channel, you probably know that most of the episodes are about an hour and a half to 2 hours long. Talking to Angry, we ended up speaking for about 4 hours. That was a heck of a lot of content to cut together. So what we're going to do with this one, we're going to separate it out into 3 different episodes. This is the first of the 3. This one we're going to be generally talking about D&D, doing some game design analysis, and looking at how D&D was created. The second episode we're going to be focusing more on analysing some of the game systems, and the third episode is more focused on encounters in general. Hopefully each one should be about an hour to an hour and a half, I think. So expect those to be rolling out over the next few weeks, every Sunday, I think, for the next couple weeks. And then by then we should have the next episode fully edited up, and I think that's going to be with Izzy. So thanks for bearing with me. Hopefully this will keep you guys entertained for a little while, and it's not going to be too much. I know that some of the episodes can be quite a lot to take in, which is kind of why I've been spacing things out a bit more. We seem to get a bit of a better reception doing things on a monthly basis instead of just week to week, because it's a lot to keep up with. But with all that said, we've now got a special offer for you for the first time on our channel. Now, if you're already interested in the sound of our guest, or who knows, it's almost Christmas, well, good news, you can grab a copy of the Angry GM's book, Game Angry, How to RPG the Angry Way, with 10% off your print or electronic copy. Just head over to angry.games/shop and use the code HOMEBREWERS. That's HOMEBREWERS, all one word. And that discount will work until December 31st. It's a great encapsulation of some of Angry's best GM advice for players and GMs alike. So head on down and grab the link in the description. We've got it all copied there for you in case you need it. And if you're still not sold on him, then let's introduce the man himself. Alright, so we have Mr. Angry on the show. Thank you so much again for spending your time here with us. Really great to have you on the show.
Please call me Angry. Mr. Angry is my father.
I'll try and keep to that.
Or the Angry.
Exactly.
But that's very formal. You know, the Angry.
Oh yeah, we try and keep it relaxed.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, not at all. Absolutely. So I'm curious, what was your first tabletop role-playing game experience?
Oh, wow. So in 1988, so my first tabletop experience was actually with a game I don't think anybody has ever heard of anymore. It's called Lords of Creation, and I don't remember who made it, and I remember nothing about it. What happened was I had an older cousin who went away to college, and he left me a box of all of his old role-playing gaming material. And I knew nothing about role-playing games at the time. And the only complete set of rules in that box, it was just like random modules and notes and things. And the only thing that was complete in the box was this game called Lords of Creation. And the premise of it is that the players are essentially gods and control the universe, I think. But I couldn't make any sense of it at all. I had no idea what it was because I didn't know what role-playing games was, and I was 10. And it's not a beginner product. So,
oh, yeah.
But I was intrigued enough, and there was a Tunnels and Trolls solo module in there also. which Tunnels and Trolls came out just a little after D&D by the delightfully grumpy Ken St. Andre, who I finally met him at a convention a few years ago, and he's still delightfully grumpy about Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, so you guys have a lot in common.
But so I did the little solo adventure, and I'm like, oh, this is really fun, and convinced my parents to take me to the Walden Books at the mall, because at that time, we still had bookstores in the world. And there I saw Frank Menser's Dungeons and Dragons basic set in the classic red box with the Larry Elmore cover with the dragon on it. That I picked up, read through it, which, by the way, that was probably the best beginner product ever in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, just because of the way it introduced the game. And so I read through that, and I fell in love with it and kidnapped 3 of my friends, dragged them to my house one day and made them play it. 2 of them never wanted to do it again, but one was hooked. Eventually we found another person, and from that point on, I have been the GM.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, that's 32 years now.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so, geez, that's basically 75% of my life has been spent as the GM. And you know what I mean when I say that. You're the one who's always running the game.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if you don't run it, it doesn't get played.
Right. And these days, I'm always running the game, because if I don't run it, it doesn't get run right. So.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm fortunate, at least, that I've reached the point where my players have now grown up and become fledgling DMs themselves and have gone off into the world. So I get to occasionally play in their games, which is, I think, kind of why you start getting your friends to play in the first place.
I mostly got my friends to play out of spite. I needed victims.
Oh, this was back in the day when you could actually kill your players, though.
Yeah, the game system wasn't quite an obstacle to getting people dead, so.
Yeah.
Now, man, it's almost like Wizards of the Coast doesn't want the characters to die.
I know, right? It's just not the game it used to be. A DM used to be known by their dungeon, not by their storylines.
Right? Well, it actually was very interesting, because in this whole time, you could actually watch the shift of Dungeons & Dragons as people were discovering what could be done with it. You know, like, obviously I got into it in the late 80s, so I had to catch up on some of this stuff. And it took me a few years to discover that several years prior, people had discovered that you could actually tell a story with D&D instead of just running a dungeon. I mean, basically the turning point was the publication of Ravenloft. And that was sort of the first revelation that role-playing games in general could be used for more than just that kind of adventuring. At least D&D. I mean, there were other games that were doing things like that, but they were the exception,
Absolutely. And I feel like it's almost like the Gygaxian propaganda, or like rhetoric of if you see like any documentaries about Gygax and the early days of D&D, I think there is a kind of almost like cult-like grandeur to the idea that he came up with this new type of game for the first time in generations, and it's this brilliant framework from which you can tell stories in a whole new way and engage everyone's imaginations. It's like it has a kind of a cult-like presence to the idea of it.
Well, I mean, every person who looks back at the history of a thing is viewing it through the modern lens. So now it is very common to look at role-playing games as a shared storytelling experience, and you can probably hear my sarcastic air quotes around that. And so when we talk about the development of D&D, a lot of documentaries sort of romanticize that idea and say, oh, you know, and he invented this way of telling stories instead of just playing out war games. And it was
exactly, yeah.
You know, well, first of all, there's a lot of debate still and a lot of argument as to how much of this was Guy Gax and how much of it was Dave Arneson, the person that he worked with. You know, in fact, here in Wisconsin, there is at least one wargaming group that attends a number of conventions, including GaryCon, which is held in Lake Geneva, which is where Gary Gygax grew up and where he published D&D in the first place. You know, that's where TSR was based. They show up every year, and they have this whole display that they put up that talks about how Dave Arneson was actually the real brains behind D&D. And then when you start to dig behind the scenes and you look at some of the revisions to the game and the fact that they were made specifically to cut Arneson out of royalty payments and stuff like that, then you start to wonder, like, how much of, I mean, you've got, on the one hand, revisionist history, and then on the other hand, you have all this romanticization, that's a tough word. You know, this romantic view of role-playing games that is just sort of bled back into the past. You know, so who knows what's true anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it is kind of like the game's dirty history, or like dirty laundry, if you will. This whole like contention over the genesis of it. But I mean, certainly these days, it's definitely transformed over time. Like every version of D&D has been its own product that doesn't do the same thing as the one before it in any way, I don't think.
Well, in some ways, yes, but in other ways, I would say that there are some very important evolutions in Dungeons & Dragons and in role-playing games in general. Though I have to be careful saying that because I obviously haven't played every indie game that exists. So every time I say, you know, in general, in the role-playing game community, this thing hasn't evolved, and then someone will point out, you know, like, well, what about Hearts of Twilight from Random Dude 72 who who sells it pay what you want on Drive-Thru-RPG? And it's like, yeah, okay. But if the average person can't even, you know, name the title of your product and has never seen it, you are not really evolving the industry. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that, you know. It's like, and when I say this stuff, I'm looking at a bigger picture, and that is the consideration of the industry as a whole. And when you're considering the industry as a whole, it's Dungeons and Dragons that sets the direction. And it always will. I mean, you look at the revision of Pathfinder, which originally was published as a counterpoint to Dungeons and Dragons.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. I mean, it was published to capitalize on not making the changes that Dungeons and Dragons was making. And now you look at Pathfinder's second edition, and while it's still true in some ways to the spirit of Pathfinder, and again, I should be careful because I haven't run the game. I've now reviewed most of the rules. But in a lot of important ways, you can see how it's playing Follow the Leader with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, and that's the way it's going to be. And it's funny, too, when you have these conversations with people, particularly people who pride themselves on being part of the independent role-playing game scene. You know, the people who are playing every latest hack of Apocalypse World, which, you know, when you bring this up to those people, you know, you get that hipsterish attitude of, well, you know, we shouldn't pay attention to Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is, people only mention it because it's popular, you know, but that doesn't make it good. And it's like, well, wait a second. Why is Dungeons and Dragons popular? Nothing is popular by accident, and nothing remains popular for 50 years by accident. You know, no matter how much you want to call, everything trades on the, Wizards of the Coast is trading on the name Dungeons and Dragons. That's the only reason people keep coming back to it. It's like, no, because eventually people stop coming back to a name. You know, the name doesn't draw people forever, as Disney has learned with the Star Wars films.
Exactly.
There is a point, you can destroy any name if you work hard enough at it. So the fact that Dungeons & Dragons still remains popular and still dominates the industry is about more than marketing and name recognition. It's doing things that are right. And if you want to make a role-playing game, whether you want to imitate Dungeons & Dragons or you want to do your own thing, you would be foolish to ignore Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think it like harks back to stories I've heard from the 90s where it was actually like D&D was really like lame. Like no one wanted to play it because it had been kind of done and everyone was moving on to other games like White Wolf and all the edgy stuff was really popular.
Well, the funny thing is, if you talk to recent D&D fans, younger people who have discovered D&D for the first time in their lives, you see a lot of people, particularly in journalism, who are very excited about how D&D is becoming mainstream and how D&D is selling so much better than it ever did before and how it's so popular and now it's okay to play D&D. And I try to tell people, you know what? 10 years ago or 12 years ago now, all those same articles were coming out. And 8 years before that, all those same articles were coming out. And then if you go back 8, 9, 9, 12, I can't remember when the edition switched. But basically every time a new edition of D&D comes out, it is precisely because the edition has been faltering, sales have been dropping off, popularity has been dropping off, it has been fading into obscurity. They publish a new edition, they get a lot of people excited about it, and then everybody's, oh my goodness, D&D's back, it's better than ever, it's more popular than it ever was. And so obviously D&D is becoming mainstream and all of this, and then, you know, and we'll be seeing that in another 5 years when they release 6th edition. And it'll be, you know, but everybody has such a short memory for this. They think this is the first time D&D has ever come back and it's more popular than ever, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
But so, wow. And I guess I'm really bitter and cynical. And I also don't remember the point that originally got me started on this whole thing. But yeah, it's just, oh, okay. What I was saying, though, is that I think in a lot of important ways, Dungeons & Dragons is not really evolving, and role-playing games are not really evolving. I think in a lot of ways, they're still stuck in the past. And attempts to challenge them usually, it's you know what? I'll give you an example.
Sure.
Okay? Let's take the 6 ability scores, which every gamer can now rattle off. Strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, right?
Exactly.
It is a perfect, complete, descriptive way of defining a living sentient being, right? It leaves nothing out. There's no overlap. It's the best way to do it.
It's very neat.
Right? Right. Everybody thinks it's really neat. So what's the difference between intelligence and wisdom?
So intelligence is like rational and logical thought. Wisdom tends to be more intuitive and, I suppose, instinctual.
Okay. Now, so how then does perception fall into wisdom?
Arbitrarily?
Okay. Willpower, fearlessness. You're attacked by a fear spell. Where does your willpower live? Wisdom?
According to 5th edition, yes.
But isn't charisma now willpower?
As the force of personality. Well, I suppose you would be resisting their force of personality. I mean, I understand that it's like, this is very arbitrary and like you could argue it for hours. I'm sure people do.
Right. Well, and that's sort of my point. Here's another one. Dexterity, right, is your balance and it is your hand-eye coordination, right? So a gymnast is a really good lockpick, locksmith. By virtue of having to learn how to walk on a balance beam, they are better at picking locks. Because in the D&D world, manual dexterity and physical coordination are the same thing. And what even is the difference between strength and constitution? I mean, if strength is your resistance to being shoved around, and knocked down. Okay, so there is this, my point here is that there's this myth that these 6 ability scores are a perfect representation. That we somehow evolved to the pinnacle of describing a living sentient being with these 6 ability scores. And so everybody does them now. Or, sometimes people will be like, it's really weird to have perception as wisdom. So we're going to separate it. We'll make a separate stat for perception, or something like that. People will make one little tweak. Okay. I got into an argument with some people who were building a Pokemon role-playing game.
Okay.
Yeah, because they're starting with ability scores, because you have to start with ability scores. There's no other way to do it, which even that's kind of an odd assumption.
Yeah.
But you're starting with ability scores. And so what ability scores are they going with? Well, you have living sentient beings running around doing things. So strength, intelligence, dexterity, yada, 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 yada. Right?
I mean, sure.
But in the Pokemon universe, in the cartoons, in the video games, in the card game, in whatever Pokemon media you want, when has a 10-year-old Pokemon trainer ever exerted their own physical strength to significantly overcome a challenge?
No, it's not like that doesn't factor into Pokemon as far as the trainers, right?
Right. Well, if there's a barricade, what does the trainer do? Onyx Dude or Geoface or whatever, smash that boulder.
Yeah, they rely on the Pokemon to solve all their problems. Like, even in the games, it's a meme that you can't cut down a plant in front of you. You have to get a Pokemon to learn how to do it.
Right. But it's also representative of the fact that in that world, the Pokemon or the trainers interact with the world through the Pokemon. So the trainer's ability scores should be almost entirely, and I'm not saying completely entirely, but almost entirely, those ability scores they need to interact with their Pokemon.
Sure, that makes sense.
Right. But again, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, unquestioned. It's a default template. It's bad enough that nobody ever considers an alternative. That even many independent games start there. I mean, Apocalypse World pretty much starts there, right?
True.
And for that matter, many independent games follow the D&D's standard now of the universal ability check as the method of action resolution. You start with an ability check, you modify it based on a skill, and then you use that to determine the result. If they do anything funky, they're always playing with, we have to have a fail forward mechanic, or you have to have some kind of, partial success mechanic, or success with a cost, that kind of a thing. But that's where they start playing with the dice mechanic, but they don't even look beyond the assumptions that are coming from this idea of, there's 6 ability scores and those describe how you interact with the world. And they will always be 3 physical, 3 mental, because here you go. That's how you describe a person. Well, it's almost, it's mimetic.
Like, I totally see why people would do that it feels almost to me like they don't have enough experience with other games, because from playing, say, White Wolf games, they do have kind of, I think it's 6 base stats that then evolve into like 100 different skills or whatever, and it's more skill focused. In like Lancer, for example, with like mechs, you have like what you were discussing with like Pokemon, where you have the distinction between your character's abilities and the mech's abilities, and they're very contextually applied.
Well, and remember, this is where my disclaimer comes in that I can't be responsible for knowing every game. I'm looking
absolutely.
at overall patterns. And ultimately, the question to begin with is D&D really evolving? Is it changing? Is every edition of D&D really different?
I see what you're saying, yeah.
Right. And beyond that, a lot of times, and again, I can't speak for every game out there, you know, and especially it's wonderful that there's a lot of creators out there who can do their own thing. And there are a lot of brilliant people who actually start from a blank page and think about what they're trying to do. But there's also a lot of deliberate, I guess, subversions of the D&D model where it's almost like, I'm going to write my role-playing game and it's not going to have ability scores because D&D has ability scores. You know, where you're starting the mechanic. It's an impure way to start the design. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I think you're not
follow.
sitting there saying, okay, what am I trying to do with this game? What am I trying to do with this world? You know, something like the mech combat game that you just mentioned, that actually makes perfect sense. That's someone who actually thought from the beginning. It's like, okay, what is this game really about? How does the mech pilot interact with the world? Because that's really what every role-playing game mechanic is about, right? It's about how does the player, through their character, interact with the world, right? And that question should be the most central question to role-playing game design. I mean, I watch a lot of amateur designers who are just working on their own little projects. You know, a lot of them come to me for advice, you know, just members of my community and whatever. And the first disclaimer I have to give them is that they have actually never seen me publish a real game. You know, I'm still technically unpublished. There is no sense in which I could actually call myself a game designer.
But you do some really interesting work with like deconstructing and reconstructing like D&D very heavily, I think.
Well, you know, D&D, I mean, I used to play a lot more games. I will say that. And now it is D&D almost exclusively. But to be fair, if you're going to comment on and critique the role-playing game universe, and you are also going to take it upon yourself at the mission to bring new people into the role-playing game community, once again, you'd be foolish to ignore D&D. That's going to be the entry point, and it's the easiest entry point.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, because it is like having another resurgence at the moment, I mean, people want to call it a renaissance, but it's not. It's like it's just coming back again, like you said.
Right.
But I think like
it's one of those cycle, like the Hindu cycle of the destruction and reconstruction of the universe.
Exactly.
You know,
and because you have so many people coming into TTRPGs in general through D&D, I think maybe because it is popular at the moment, you're going to get a lot of people wanting to explore the genre and create their own games. But D&D is the only thing, the point of reference they have, right? So maybe that's part of the reason why you see so much copying from it.
But then you start looking at the bigger designers. You know, because there are big designers out there other than Dungeons and Dragons. You know, other than Wizards of the Coast. I mean, you have to forgive Paizo. Because they basically, their business model was publishing third-party content for D&D, and then when D&D said they couldn't do it anymore, they're basically, well, we'll just make our own D&D.
With blackjack and
you know, and then we'll publish third-party content for that.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, and man, are they ever good at publishing third-party content for the license they own?
Oh yes, the Lost Art, the Splat book,
right? But, you know, you have your other companies out there. You've got Monty Cook out there. You've got Modifius. And Modifius actually does some interesting stuff. And you have, can't remember who does Savage Worlds, which I guess is kind of sad. Schwalb did Shadow of the Demon Lord. Now he's doing Shadow of the Demon Lord, except not so bizarre and focused on poop and blood.
Sure.
So, which there was a weird tone to that game. You know,
I'm just having flashbacks to the Binding of Isaac.
Right? Yeah, actually, Shadow of the Demon Lord perfectly is like Bloodborne meets Binding of Isaac in role-playing game form.
And she sounds amazing.
Yeah. Do you have any experience with Shadow of the Demon Lord? Have you looked at it?
Don't. It's the first time I'm hearing of it.
Oh, I guess, I can't do the genres. I don't know. It's spell punk, gas lamp, fantasy, steampunk, Victorian era, you know, like that kind of era where it's fantasy, but guns and no armor also.
Yeah, when you said Bloodborne, that set a very specific
it's the
image in mind.
Bloodborne aesthetic. Right. It's the Bloodborne aesthetic. It is a decaying, dying world that is imminently facing an invasion by the titular demon lord. So the world is basically falling. It's one step from falling. It's like the day before Bloodborne. Again, you know, and it has a lot of really interesting ideas, and for some bizarre reason, it's also really gross. There are a lot of odd spells and effects and curses and things that have to do with bodily functions.
Oh, wow.
When I said there's a lot of poop involved, I wasn't joking. Like every fifth spell has something to do with, you know, people, you know, pooping or whatever. I know we talked about it before, but I'm still trying to school my language here.
I appreciate that.
You know, so it's a really odd tonal decision. And now, as I heard it, I haven't checked out the news lately on it, but Schwalbe is publishing, and his work is really good. He's a really talented designer. I like his stuff. But he is now publishing, I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically Shadows of the Schmiebenschmord. You know, it's like I'll take the poop out now. It's basic. It's lightened up. That's what it is, because it has a really grim, dark, and somewhat repulsive tone to it that turned people off, and I think he's trying to veer away from that now. Something a little bit more upbeat and happy.
That's fair.
It's happy in the sense of, just get a bunch of, armored mercenaries to go down into a bunch of green-skinned people's houses, kill them all, and take their stuff. That sort of happy.
So the good old days of D&D.
But yeah. Anyway, so
I think...
I'm sorry, what was the question?
So earlier we were saying the 6 ability scores, and you were talking about... I think you were going into kind of like D&D Heartbreakers, or like people using D&D as a basis for creating new systems, but not being especially innovative.
Well, I actually, what I really want to do is blame D&D for not thinking twice about this stuff.
Well, I think one thing I have heard about 5th edition is that during development, obviously they had a very open approach to it. So they were actively getting the community feedback on everything.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that came out of that is that when they tried to take out things like fireball and your magic missile and like the very like classical D&D elements, people really complained about it. And obviously now you end up with these really broken elements in the game because they're quintessentially D&D. So I wonder how much that is the public to blame for it, or if the people who play D&D, like the community itself, isn't necessarily ready to change what D&D is.
Well, okay, I have a lot of answers to that.
Sure.
Because first of all, you cannot blame the community for what they design if the game designers ask the community to design the game.
That is
a mistake. The game designers made that mistake, not the community. Okay. Because the average member of the community is not a game designer. And on top of that, something that's very important for designers to remember is that the average person does not know what they want and does not know what they like until it's in front of them.
True.
Okay. So asking people to design their dream, ask the average person to design their dream game, you're going to get a mess. You know, there was a very famous episode of The Simpsons, 20, 25 years ago when The Simpsons was still good. And man, it's getting longer and longer that I have to say that. Also, saying that makes me feel old. But Homer gets hired by a car company to design a car for the everyman.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a perfect illustration of that point. If you ask the everyman or every person, what do you want? It will be a mess. Especially because a lot of design happens in adversity. A lot of design comes from compromising because you realize you have two conflicting goals, or two different people who you want to satisfy want two different things, and you have to find the creative way to make both of them happy. One of the things you see with 5th edition is that Wizards of the Coast has become very innovation shy, because their perception, rightly or wrongly, and the community certainly has lots of opinions on this, is that 4th edition was a failure. Okay. And in some ways it was, because after about 2 years of playing it, the community of established GMs started to flee Dungeons and Dragons. And Paizo was picking them up. And as far as I see, and of course I'm an outsider like anybody. I can just talk about what I saw and who I was talking to at the time. And interestingly enough, I came into the sort of broader D&D community and started blogging and started designing and stuff when 4th edition came out. So even though I've been around in the RPG space for a long time, playing games and hanging out at game stores and talking to the community and stuff, I was a lurker until that point. So one of the things, I also got very involved in organized play starting in 4th edition. In fact, I ran some of the first D&D 4th edition games that ever got run at Gen Con.
Oh, like the formal, Adventure League play.
Yeah, exactly. I was in that stuff from the beginning. And one of the things you started to see very early on, and it continued, was a shift in the ages of the people who were playing D&D. Because while 4th edition was losing a lot of the established D&D gamers, because it had made a lot of changes, it was a very drastic innovation. And in fact, I will still say that 4th edition is probably the most interesting edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and it was the bravest thing Wizards of the Coast has ever done.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
But what you saw was this shift in the demographic where they were getting very young people into the game. 10, 12, preteen kids showing up and playing D&D and grasping it. And which I shouldn't say that like I'm surprised, because something that irks me in the gaming community is the disdain that people have for children. The belief that in order to get a 10-year-old to understand D&D, you have to somehow dumb it down. Yeah. That you need to make special games for kids. It's like, you know what? I was 10 years old. I was 11 years old when I played Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition and learned it from a book. Okay, because we didn't have YouTube back then. Yeah. So nobody was showing me what to do. I had no one. So that level of disrespect for what a kid can figure out. But that said, 4th edition was building a new group of D&D players, a new generation. Okay. But it was losing the old timers. It was losing the grognards.
Yeah.
And I think what happened inside Wizards of the Coast, apart from, okay, so there was some of this has become sort of public knowledge. Some of it is murky and rumors. But there was some dealings between Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, and some promises that Wizards of the Coast made to Hasbro about what 4th edition was going to do that it didn't deliver on, that essentially meant that from a business perspective, 4th edition had set a very high bar for success for itself. The phrase triple the sales
wow.
of D&D was bounced around. Okay. But that's a whole other story. But I think what happened inside Wizards of the Coast was not so much that Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition was a failure, but that, number one, it did not live up to the bar that they had set for itself. And there are reasons that have to do with Hasbro's corporate structure and changes that were made to how they deal with their brands. And I'm probably the only person in the community that actually listens to Hasbro's corporate calls and follows this stuff.
Oh, wow.
But there was stuff that went on about how Hasbro handles things that necessitated D&D making some big promises to get some checks out of Hasbro.
Right.
Okay. And by the way, anybody out there who's listening who thinks Hasbro has any say over how D&D is managed, Hasbro really doesn't care about D&D. They care about it insofar as it might be a licensing product for them.
Yeah, I mean, they have much bigger IPs.
Right. With Dungeons and Dragons, and interestingly enough, they would care more about Dungeons and Dragons if not for the way their buyout of Wizards of the Coast was structured to begin with, which separated Wizards of the Coast and Magic as two separate financial entities. But
I see.
Again, that's all very technical stuff. But the point is, I think what happened with 4th edition is that the bean counters inside Wizards of the Coast, number one, they saw that this wasn't living up to the promises they made Hasbro, and Hasbro was pretty much cutting them off at that point and saying, look, Dungeons & Dragons is on its own now. It's not a supported brand. Sink or swim on your own merits. We are not doing anything for you anymore. And on the other hand, they were watching Paizo's market share creep up and up and up and up. And at the same time, the marketers inside Wizards of the Coast, they have this term there called the older cousin model. It refers to the belief that the only way to get a new player into Dungeons and Dragons is to have another person in that person's life teach them the game. The older cousin model.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that did feel like how it was for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and honestly, when it changed, that was not... Like, it has only changed recently thanks to YouTube and live streaming of games.
Yeah.
And even then, there's a lot of questions as to how effective that actually is. It's another thing that has been romanticized. And Wizards of the Coast romanticized it for marketing purposes. But their view is that if all of their established DMs leave, they would have to figure out how to market D&D without the older cousin.
Right.
Right. And so we have the 5th edition of the game where they basically went to the community and said, well, you guys designed the perfect edition of D&D. Let's do a best of D&D. Okay? Yeah. So everybody come and tell us what makes D&D D&D, and we'll make the game out of that.
And this was, like, obviously before the massive explosion that's happened since. So at the time, it was kind of in a dying state. It didn't have that resurgence already. Like, I mean, it had come and gone, like, way long ago.
Well, but hold on. I mean, because how big of an explosion was it really?
The one during 5th edition?
Mm-hmm. How big?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I've only been playing since 3.5.
Right.
So that was my introduction. And I would say that since then, probably 5th edition is the first explosion that I've witnessed personally.
Okay.
So from my perspective, it looks impressive.
Do you, like, how many people are playing Dungeons and Dragons worldwide?
I could not even guess.
Right.
I mean, I would assume millions.
You would, well, I don't know. There's only one person or one entity that knows, and they don't have to tell us. Okay. You can start to find out information about how big the role-playing community is really. If you really start to dig, and there are some excellent resources out there like ICV2 that they at least track sales data from basically all their participating hobby shops and whatever. And they usually have some good relative numbers to tell you, like how one game is performing relative to another and stuff like that. But almost no one knows, you know, how big is role-playing games? How much money is there in it? You know, how big is the community? And I'll give you an example of why this is important, because so not too long ago, Wizards of the Coast publicly bragged that 50% of D&D players have watched a live streamed game on YouTube. Okay. Now that sounds neat. That's like, oh my goodness. Live streaming is doing so much good for Dungeons and Dragons, right? Obviously.
It sounds like that.
Right. But here's the thing. 50% of players is 50% of current players. So half of the current players who play D&D have watched a stream on YouTube. How many streams have they watched? They just caught one episode of one and decided it's not for them. And how many of those players started playing D&D because they watched the stream? How many of them were just players already? Right? The statement is a carefully worded statement.
Yeah, because half is not a number, right?
Right. Half is not a number, but it also doesn't... because the information you want to know is how many people started playing Dungeons & Dragons because they watched a stream. And that's not in that data. That advertising blurb is... we know 50% of the people who are playing D&D today have at some point watched at least one live stream. But those people could all have been playing D&D for 20 years and live streaming has gotten no one into the game. Okay. So that's the first thing that makes me suspicious. The second thing that makes me suspicious, though, is let's say I'm a company like Wizards of the Coast. And because I have this information, I do market research. I know how many people actually have started playing D&D or at least buying D&D products as a result, or at least I can estimate, as a result of watching a stream. Because, you give out those marketing surveys every once in a while. How did you hear about our product? What made you buy this, right?
Sure.
And then use that. Yeah, there's all market research, focus groups, all these resources these big companies have. So I have all the data. If the best thing I can say that is not a lie is half the current player base has watched at least one stream. Yeah. Like, what data am I drawing from that's the best compliment that I can find to pay D&D?
Yeah, when you put it that way.
Because, right, if I could say 10 million people started playing D&D directly as a result of streaming, I would say that, or at least I would say millions of new players have started playing D&D thanks to live streaming. But if the best thing I can say is, 50% of our players have watched the live stream, it sounds like I'm saying the same thing. But when you read it in corporate speak and you ask, so what, because as a company, you want to say the best thing possible, right?
Sure.
Wizards of the Coast, it is to their advantage to make their products look as good as possible. Not just to their customers, but also if they ever want to float a loan. They want to borrow money from a bank, they want their products to look good. If they ever, Wizards of the Coast isn't publicly traded, so investment financing is a little different, but they do want occasionally to attract money from Hasbro. There are advantages to a company making themselves look good to the world. So they want to say the best stuff possible.
Sure.
And these are the things they're saying. The core rule books for 5th edition have outsold any previous core rule books in D&D. Wow, that sounds really good, except duh. Well, there's more people on Earth today than there were 10 years ago.
So what you're saying is that, like, it isn't necessarily that D&D has recently gone through another explosion in popularity. It's more that the existing base has become more vocal about it.
I don't even think it's that. I think it's all marketing. And I think, again, it is the same marketing. Have you ever heard the term advertising masquerading as news?
Sounds familiar.
Okay, I think it was a term coined by this website FARK, F-A-R-K.
I've heard of that before.
Yeah, they basically accumulate news stories and then add funny headlines to them that point out how ridiculous the ridiculous choices that various media outlets make in what actually is news. Okay, so every once in a while, you will get someone writing an article, like someone writing an opinion piece on, say, the Washington Post or whatever, about how D&D is more popular than ever. A fluff piece, right?
Sure.
Right. How do those happen?
I'm assuming they get paid to do it.
Right. They get paid to talk this up. They don't cite a lot of information. They don't talk data or numbers. They just talk about how awesome it is to play D&D. They copy and paste a few tweets from people who just discovered D&D and make it look so much fun. They mention that Critical Role exists, and then they call it a day. And these people, they don't necessarily decide it just because, well, I have to write an opinion piece for page 7 today. What could I write about? Well, I like Dungeons and Dragons. It's usually because somebody has encouraged them to, just write a nice piece. It's an opinion piece. It's not, and it's not advertising. It's news. Because it's an opinion piece, right?
Sure.
Or it's a news story. It's about how D&D is doing so much better than it's ever done before. And those are also to Wizards of the Coast benefit.
Yeah, that has kind of been the the subtitle for 5th edition. It's been like the story that they're selling with it since its inception.
Right. I know it's a loaded word, but it's Wizards of the Coast narrative.
Exactly, that's the word, the narrative, yeah.
Right, it's the 5th edition narrative. This is the greatest version of the best role-playing game ever, right? Or the greatest edition of the best role-playing game ever. Okay, and it's back. It's back. Come back to us. Give up on Pathfinder. I know you left. I know we broke your heart with 4th edition. Come back. Because D&D is where it's at now. It's better than ever.
Yeah, we innovated, we lost everyone, so we put all the stuff back in.
Right.
And it's very much like the Siren song.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. So when we talk about, there's this huge explosion in popularity, how much is that explosion really? And how much has it ever been? It's really like, I realize that this has gone off in a weird tangent because we're not talking about my home brewing at all. I'm just like basically dissing Wizards of the Coast here.
Well, no, it's still interesting.
But I am, and I'm not even opposed to D&D. I obviously like D&D a great deal, or I wouldn't be writing so much about it. In fact, I spend so much time fixing it because I want it to be the game that it was promised.
For sure.
To be. But the problem is currently there is a lot of, and I keep using this word, there's a lot of starry-eyed romanticism in the gaming community that I think is to the great benefit of the people selling role-playing games.
Well, nostalgia is like super marketable right now.
Right. Well, but see, now that's interesting too. And here's another weird tangent. I have noticed, this is just now my personal sort of anecdotal stuff.
Sure.
This is just me looking at trends here. This is not, I don't have any secret information or anything. I haven't done any specific market research, but there is an interesting trend these days in all forms of media to sell nostalgia to people who are too young to be nostalgic for the things they are being sold.
Yeah, that's absolutely like something you don't really notice, but it's there.
Like how many people, like Curse of Strahd, okay? Ravenloft was one of the most innovative, one of the greatest adventure modules written for D&D, in my correct opinion. Curse of Strahd sells on that nostalgia. Most of the people who are buying and playing and talking about D&D online these days are too young to have ever even seen the cover of Ravenloft.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? Tomb of Annihilation is Tomb of Horrors. Against the Giants is, the Giants series. The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh and all the, that whole line of adventure modules, the U1 through U whatever line that all came out of the United Kingdom. That whole thing was Ghosts of Saltmarsh.
Yeah, and I think it was Kaim I was talking to recently, was saying a very similar thing about not Planescape. What was it? The space D&D setting?
Oh, Spelljammer.
Spelljammer, yeah. Like, so many people are calling for this to be brought back, but how many people have actually played it?
Well, very few people played Spelljammer. That's kind of why well, no, actually Spelljammer was okay back in the day. It was unique.
Yeah, I think but it wasn't like comparable to trying to think of the current one, Forgotten Realms. Yeah,
Forgotten Realms, or even Greyhawk, which still has a big calling to bring that back.
It feels almost like they're more interested in the idea of it because there is a kind of mystical kind of like uncertainty about what exactly it was. And people have a lot of really interesting ideas of what it might have been, and they want that to be realized or something.
See, I have an interesting theory about this.
Shoot.
I blame the parents and the old timers. Okay. Well, no, I've spent years and years talking about all of these great adventure modules and experiences I had from my youth. I'm nostalgic for them. And of course, nostalgia is an illusion anyway, because most of your good feelings for the things from your past are actually the good feelings for the days when you weren't an adult. When life was a lot easier and all you had to do was come home from school and then play games with your friends 4 times a week. Okay. And you had that childlike joy and that childlike wonder. And every issue of Dungeon Magazine that arrived in my mailbox, I was like pouring through it, and I have such fond memories of it. And you go back now and you try to read through some of this stuff, and it's like, wow, I realized, first of all, a lot of this stuff was not great. And second of all, I didn't read a lot of this stuff. I just skimmed it and looked at it and fantasized about the maps, and then that was it. And then the magazine would go on my shelf. But we talk all of this stuff up. And people's parents talk all this stuff up, because basically, I think in a lot of ways, the generation of younger people, the people in their 20s now, the people who have buying power now, are the first generation to be raised by nerds.
That's fair, yeah.
Okay. Because there was the nerd generation, and they all hidden in their basements, and we all played video games and read comic books and did all those shameful things that we didn't talk about when we were a kid. Or I say when I was a kid, And then we grew up and, except for those of us who are trying to break into role-playing game design and gave up a decent career in accounting to do it, we control the world now. All the nerds now have the power, and our kids have heard us reminiscing about all the great things from our youth. All of the D&D adventures, all of the comic books that we read, the superheroes, all the video games. Why is retro gaming such a big thing among 20-somethings? It breaks my heart to hear a kid say, I'm really into retro gaming. I've been playing Super Mario 64. I'm like, you know what? 20 years ago, I just called that gaming, and you weren't even a zygote. Don't you get nostalgic for my stuff? And at the same time, like every older generation, there's also the disdain for the crap the kids have today. It's like, how many complaints do you hear in the video game? Oh, games today are so much easier. Back when I had to play Mega Man, you had no idea how, it was the greatest thing ever. And I worked so hard and then finally killed Dr. Wily. Except I shouldn't say, you never killed Dr. Wily. It was the one time you thought you did, but it was a fake out.
Yeah.
But stuff like that. So you combine all of that nostalgic reminiscence among that older generation when they're talking to their kids, when they're talking, or, talking to the community online. The internet bringing everyone together so that now all of the people like me and you and all of us, we can talk about what we had and set up all the fan websites and blogs and the YouTubes and the Tumblrs, and I don't know what the kids are doing these days on the computer, but about all of our old fandoms. And kids today looking around, and they're like, none of this stuff seems particularly great that we have. I wonder what it was like back in the old days. Everybody's talking up how great, classic Nintendo games were. Maybe I should try some of them, And, of course, the sad thing is it's all kind of a lie anyway, because, again, nostalgia is a big illusion.
Yeah.
You're not really nostalgic for all the things. Let's be honest. There were some really great classic Nintendo and Super Nintendo games, but mostly they're just old, and a lot of them are unplayable.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of them were just outright brutal. So it's but the thing is, the innovation in these fields, in the media fields, has slowed down because it's become more incremental. And at the same time, you have an older generation of people who are filled with wide-eyed wonder over the giant leaps that were made.
Yeah, those leaps were really what kind of encapsulated the audience at the time. Right.
They were things that had never been done before. And so now we have a generation, probably a little jaded and probably looking for all those wonderful things that their older generation is talking about and having such wonderful memories of. And that's why the player's handbook can sell to 20-somethings sidebars about how to fit halflings into Dragonlance. Who's thought about I know I'm going to infuriate Dragonlance fans here, but who's thought about Dragonlance in the past 20 years?
Yeah, it's not been the most sought after setting, I don't think. Right. Obviously everyone who liked it is going to be crying out for it, but
yeah. But so it's D&D 5e. And I think about this too. And I think about, I try to picture the designers of D&D 5e and think about the fact that, okay, you have to design the edition that the community tells you to design. And every time you increment the design, you have to send it to the entire, because they were doing the open playtest thing. You send it to the entire community. The entire community is going to critique your work. And then then you take it back and you Frankenstein's monster what they come up with into the next iteration. You cannot iterate drastically. We cannot change what we are doing because it has cost us too much from a business standpoint in the past. And when all is said and done, all of your modules are going to be inspired by past classics. So please, professional game designers who love Dungeons and Dragons and who have worked with it all your lives, stop innovating, let the community tell you what to design, and then don't have original ideas, just reboot the modules of the past.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way of putting it. Like,
right?
And that brings us to the end of part 1. Part 2 is coming in 1 week's time, when we'll be going super in depth into 5th edition system analysis, looking at the exploration pillar, combat, character investment, and more. Thanks to Angry for joining us, and if you want to check out his work, head on over to theangrygm.com, and there's a discount code in the description for his book along with the store link. I'm not getting paid for that, it's just I genuinely believe that it's full of good advice that I've used myself, and of course the discount makes it a bargain just in time for Christmas. Last but not least, thank you for making it to the end of the video, and until the next adventure, stay safe.